Kia ora, ka mihi mahana, kia koutou. Very warm greetings from the New Zealand Political Studies Association. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. We're really delighted to have a terrific panel today to talk about lowering the voting age to 16, lessons for New Zealand Aotearoa from the experiences of Europe in particular. And for that, it's my great pleasure, I'm Bronwyn Hayward from the Political Science Association and here at UC, to introduce a great panel of speakers. We're ably supported by Dr. Kate Prendergast, who's head of the Civics Lab here, who'll be just keeping an eye on your questions. And if you would like to put questions to the panel afterwards, just please write them in the chat Q&A function, and Kate will be reading them through and putting them to the panel at the end. But we're going to hear 5 minutes from each of our speakers first, and I'll just introduce everyone in overview, and then we'll get cracking and get into it. So our first speaker will be Gina McLay, who is the co-director of Make It 16, the really effective youth campaign which has just taken court action to try and raise the issue of human rights and lowering the voting age to 16 here in New Zealand. Then we're joined from Paris by Dr. Sarah Pickard, who's a lecturer in politics. Her book, Politics, Participation and Youth Activism, is out with Springer. And she's joining us from Sorbonne, Nouvelle. And then Dr. Jan Eichhorn. Jan has been an expert witness for the Make It 16 campaign. He's joining us from the Université of Edinburgh, where he's a senior lecturer specialising in public participation and youth politics. Followed by Andy Mycock, who's joining us from the University of Huddesfield. And Andy leads the Lowering the Youth Vote project for the UK and will bring us some lessons from those experiences. Then coming local to look at local government, Professor James Sloan, who's Professor of Politics at Royal Holloway University, is going to speak about some of the lessons from increasing opportunities for public participation between elections and at the local level in London. And then coming back to Aotearoa, New Zealand, Dr. Lara Greaves from the University of Auckland and also Ngāpuhi iwi affiliation is a lecturer in New Zealand and Māori politics, but she's also the director of the New Zealand Election Study, which is our one major study which gathers data on New Zealand's public participation. And she's also contributing to the Youth 19 study. So she'll bring some of these lessons back home. So without further ado, we've got a lot to pack in an hour. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers. So Gina, you're really the reason, you and a whole cohort like you, that we're here. So would you mind talking to us about what the issues were that motivated Make It 16 to bring this campaign?
Thank you, Bronwyn. Yeah, kia ora, my name is Gina and I'm the co-director of Make It 16, the campaign to lower the voting age here in New Zealand. I thought to use my time, I'll give a bit of a history, a bit of a timeline of our campaign and kind of how it's come to be and what we're doing at the moment. So about a year ago, a little Facebook group was set up of people who were interested in lowering the voting age. It was kind of around the local body elections time here in New Zealand. And I just joined the Facebook group because I was like, I would love to vote and I'm probably going to be too young at the next election. You know, why not see what other people think about lowering the voting age? And so after a few months, kind of created a bit more of a formal governance structure. And we had our launch at Parliament, in New Zealand Parliament, hosted by Chloe Sorbert last September, which was really awesome. And that's where we announced our High Court case. So Make It 16, in about August this year, we went to the High Court arguing that the current voting age is a breach of human rights and a lot of specifics about how New Zealand human rights law works in relation to the Electoral Act here. And so, yeah, we announced that last September, of course, due to, you know, COVID-19 and other sort of different things happening in the world. Our case got pushed back a little bit, but that's all good now. And that's kind of been one of the main things we've been focusing on. We've had an awesome team of lawyers who have worked for us pro bono to put together the case, working with us young people who don't know too much about law, but they've been helping us, teaching us a lot about how we could you know, go through that case. Unfortunately, we did lose, but we are going to the Court of Appeal, which will probably happen early next year, which is really awesome. And so, yeah, that's the main thing that Make It 16 has been focusing on. But this was the year was an election year, and so we were able to bring the issue of lowering the voting age into election debates and ask political parties what their thoughts are about lowering the voting age and just youth participation in general, because we really believe that one way to increase youth participation in elections is by lowering the voting age, getting more young people engaged, getting them to vote in that first election they're eligible to in a local community, in a time where they're more likely to be able to know the issues that are around them, because they're probably going to still be in school. Start that habit off early and then continue hopefully voting long into the future as well. And so, yeah, it was really awesome to be able to talk to candidates and politicians about the idea of lowering the voting age. We even got mentioned in one of the leaders' debates, which was really awesome. The answers weren't quite what we were looking for, but it's really great to just get more of the public to hear about about the issue of lowering the voting age, because many people haven't even thought about it before. And then due to the second, I guess, resurgence of COVID-19 in New Zealand, we ended up having an election delay, which was great for me. I was able to vote due to my birthday being just in that window between the initial election date and that delay. And that was another awesome experience where we were able to talk a bit to different media outlets about how that was able to make me feel and other young people feel, knowing we were going to be able to participate in this really vital election in 2020 when so many issues are going on that young people care about, being able to have a say on our politicians who are making those decisions. And so that was another really awesome opportunity to get Make It 16 into the public spotlight, to get more people, ordinary people, thinking about why youth participation is really important. So those are kind of the main things that Make It 16 has been working on. As always, we're just a group of young people who are doing this in our spare time. We're not paid, or it's not our only work. And so it's really great that we get to meet together every week, just on a Zoom meeting like this, and talk to each other about politics, about why we want to continue fighting for what we are doing. We all come from different backgrounds, but it's really great that we're able to come together on this issue, because we really believe that lowering the voting age is a really great way to see more youth participation. We all have so many different issues we care about, and we're hoping that politicians are going to make decisions that are really going to affect us positively into the future. So that's why I'm part of Make It 16, and will hopefully continue to in the future. I'm getting a little bit older now, I guess, but it's really great that even more younger people, even younger than 16, are wanting to join us and help us out.
Kia ora, Gina, and thank you for all your mahi, all your work. It's been tremendous. And what's interesting, particularly in New Zealand, which I think is possibly not different from international debate, is that there is a growing consensus amongst experts and authorities that perhaps we need to look very carefully, and there are strong reasons for lowering the voting age, but it hasn't been an issue that's echoed with the public yet. The most recent opinion polls suggest that only about 7% of New Zealanders have thought about it, and would agree with the idea of lowering the voting age. So shifting public opinion is difficult, but it's not impossible, as we've seen with our shift in laws. For instance, Sue Bradford from the Greens had initially raised this as a bill. She didn't pursue this one, but she did pursue an equally difficult case, which was to reduce the anti-smacking law, reduce the rights for abuse as normal parental discipline. So it isn't impossible in a small society that we could get a 75% majority within Parliament agreeing, but there are lots of standard and not so standard arguments against this. And so we've asked Sarah Pickard if she'd mind. Sarah, you've had a lot of experience in terms of how people react to the concept of lowering the voting age and this arbitrary nature. Would you mind taking us through some of those from your experience?
Thank you very much for inviting us all along, and to all of you, thank you for what you're doing. So I'm just going to go through some of the arguments that politicians have had given, especially in parliamentary debates in the United Kingdom about lowering the voting age, where it's become a more prominent issue in recent years. And where most of the political parties are now in favour of lowering the voting age, except for the Conservative Party, the party in government. So one of the first arguments is that it's logistically difficult, and that it's too difficult to register 16 and 17-year-olds on the electoral register. That's what we heard before the referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union and before the general election in 2019. But obviously, if people started at some point, then one day it would be done. And if you never start, then it never will be done. And it's always thought about at the last minute or just a few weeks before. So if you never start, it can't be done. Of course it can't be done. But Scotland did it, and so it can be done and elsewhere too. A second point raised is the cost. It would cost a lot of money. This has been said by Boris Johnson and other people, that it would be expensive to register 16 and 17-year-olds and send them ballots, etc., etc. So that means that democracy seems to come at a price and citizenship comes at a price. So that might be very pragmatic from an economic point of view, but it's not exactly democratic. Another point raised is that it would reduce voter turnout. That if 16-year and 17-year-olds were allowed to vote, it would lower the overall voting age. So what? And if you don't, so what? But also, if, as Gina just said, if you don't ever get into the habit of voting, especially when you're at school, then you won't ever start until afterwards, and that's not a real impact on the voting turnout. We can come back to that. The next point is what you just talked about also, Bronwyn, is about public opinion. In public opinion polls, most people, it's not in Britain, it's more that most people in opinion polls are against lowering the voting age. But does that mean that politicians should make decisions based on demagogy and following public opinion? If that were the case, then we would still have death penalty in the UK. The next point that often is raised in arguments is citizenship. And it's a point, a very moot point. And that, for example, Boris Johnson has said that full citizenship doesn't come until 18 when you become an adult. So what does it mean, full citizenship? What does it mean before you're 18? Does it mean you're a proto-citizen, citizen in learning, or as Hen and Ford have said, an apprentice citizen? What kind of message does that send out to young people? You're not real citizens. You're not full citizens only because you haven't got the right to vote, or that that's the only way to become a full citizen. So young people are not considered citizens, but in France they are. If you don't know already, that everybody is considered as a citizen in theory, coming from the social contract and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, where there are rights and responsibilities. So the fact that young people have responsibilities but they don't have certain rights is another way of underlining that they're not full citizens, and that the fact that politicians are not actually taking them into account as full human beings. So, and young people know this, of course. If I just carry on through other points, and if we think about that, citizenship comes apparently with adulthood and voting rights, you could say, and who wouldn't want to talk about Bourdieu, that youth is a social construct. Well, then maybe citizenship and adulthood, or being young or whatever, is a social construct that can be reconstructed by governments and made to what it wants to be. And that's another argument insofar as it's not just because it's always been this way, that doesn't have to be a different way. Another point, number 6, is that different ages of legal limits or thresholds when legislatively, legally, young people are allowed to do things have been raised, and that in a kind of paternal government way. Most strikingly is that now to buy alcohol, to smoke, you have to be 18. And so it's an illustration how rights have been raised and increased. But of course, these have been introduced about alcohol and cigarettes because excessive consumption of alcohol and smoking are bad for your health. Does it mean that voting and taking part in politics is bad for your health if you can't vote when you're 16 and 17? So the suggestion is that voting is not something very healthy. Well, it has been said that politicians say that political participation is bad for young people's health, and that's another argument that's been put forward. It's been said that they should, in parliamentary debates in Britain, that young people should not have their 16 and 17-year-olds should not have their childhood squeezed, shrunk, and various other versions of that, and that 16 and 17-year-olds are vulnerable and that they could be manipulated if they had the right to vote. And we know what that means, that they could be manipulated by people who would like to have the right to vote for 16 and 17-year-olds. But also a recent argument was that young people could be exploited online if they were given the right to vote. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but that was mentioned in relation to the Brexit referendum. A more sinister point that's been raised regarding young people's health and political participation is that their brains do not mature until the age of 25. This is one thing point forward in a parliamentary debate. I'll just say that again. Brains do not mature until the age of 25. Judith Besant has written a lot about this in her new book, and it's something that is really should be looked into as kind of these biological or deterministic explanations about why young people cannot vote. In other words, 16 and 17-year-olds are not ready to vote, they're not mature. So this is one of the major points that's raised in various different forms, that young people 16 and 17 lack the maturity to be able to vote. But without naming names, or we could, are all politicians mature enough, or are they all not immature? I think maybe some politicians should look at themselves when they're thinking about the issue of young people not being mature enough to vote, to run the country even. And so we know that young people have been coping through austerity and precarity, and now through lockdown in very difficult circumstances, and most have shown great maturity in how they've managed to cope with this, but they could do with some more help from the government in that. We've also seen, of course, in the climate strikes, young people 17, 16, and going right down the age scale, being able to make mature decisions and informed decisions. And most of all, they're calling out politicians to do something about climate change, do something urgently and effectively. What does it say if they can't have the right to vote? Maybe it's too scary for politicians that they might actually have to do something and listen to those young people. But what we're saying then, for example, if we just give the example of what Greta Thunberg has said, and it's quite a nice quote in regarding that, is that politicians should stop behaving like spoilt, immature children. Maybe it's the tables could be reversed then. The Electoral Commission said back in the beginning of the century that young people are still very much developing socially and emotionally during this time of their lives. I'm just wondering, when do people stop developing socially and emotionally? I think we've all developed socially and emotionally during lockdown, so I don't think that's much of an argument either. We know that the Conservative Party in Britain allows young people who are members of the party to vote at 15 for the party leader. And in the last general, after Theresa May stepped down, they indirectly voted for the next Prime Minister, because the leader of the Conservative Party would automatically become Prime Minister. Maybe the Conservative Party looked a bit hypocritical, giving full voting rights to 15-year-olds to vote for their party leader and indirectly the Prime Minister. I could go on about that point. But the elephant in the room, and it's my last point, the elephant in the room is that most people in Britain and in most democracies tend to vote for the left wing. That's certainly the case in Britain, and especially over the last two general elections, but not always, it should be said. It's not always, they don't always mostly vote for the Labour Party. In the past, they've also voted mostly for the Conservative Party, for when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And so it's not said out loud, but maybe the most disingenuous reason is that if the Conservative Party are not giving the right of vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, is because it doesn't serve their interest. But what about the 25% of young people, or 17% around, in the last general election who did vote Conservative? What does it say to the ones who are just below that age? They're saying that we're not interested in your vote and we're not interested in you. Think of all the potential voters that they could be getting that they're not getting. What about the message that they're sending out to these young people about the fact that they're not being involved in the political process? Maybe that if Conservative Party is more proactive in their actions towards young people and encouraging the lowering of the voting age, they would get them more votes themselves. Even George Osborne, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the person who introduced enormous austerity measures that particularly affected young people in all forms of their life. He said, from a more pragmatic point of view, that when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and afterwards, that what about if the Conservative Party introduced votes at 16 in a way to reach out to young people, but to get their vote and to be attractive to them? What about being a role model for other parties and other countries, and that it would inspire young people to vote for them? And more generally, we could say, and to be, he actually said, and being on the right side of history. Because the United Kingdom was the first country to lower the voting age from 21 to 18 in 1969, shortly followed by New Zealand. What about sending out a message? If somebody doesn't make the first step, other countries have. What about sending out a message and being an inspiration? And what about if parties said that we did it first and we were on the right side of history, and we can wear that as a badge of honor towards the young people who are citizens?
Thanks so much, Sarah. And it's really interesting to hear the almost quite polarised debate that seems to be developing in Britain. And I know many of the speakers here today have warned about this risk of a culture war, that this democratic and response to a population shift and change becomes divided along party lines. Jan, you've been thinking quite hard about some of the reasons that Conservatives may support this, and also some lessons from Scotland where this polarisation was overcome. So would you mind sharing some of those insights? Thank you for joining us from Edinburgh.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to people over there again and engaging on some of this really exciting work. So yes, in Scotland, we saw the lowering of the voting age initially in 2014 for the Scottish independence referendum. And what was interesting about the lowering of the voting age, that it crossed partisan lines. It was initiated by the Scottish government, who were in favour of Scottish independence, but also unionist parties like Labour and the Liberal Democrats joined in supporting the lowering of the voting age. Subsequently, in 2015, then the Scottish Parliament voted to lower the voting age for all future elections, including the Conservatives. It was a unanimous vote. The Conservatives had changed their mind by that point. So what happened in Scotland? A lot, but most fundamentally, did we see that a lot of the sort of worries that Sarah just talked about that are often voiced simply didn't come to life. We basically were not able to see the sort of major negative effects. 16, 17-year-olds participated more than 18 to 24-year-olds, which is quite a common finding also in other countries that have lowered the voting age. We saw that young people actually increased their interest in politics and their engagement, both in political engagement and kind of party political lines and other forms in the immediate aftermath. So in other words, the experience of lowering voting at 16 itself is the causal factor that can create some changes, especially if it's linked to things like civic education. So the findings in Scotland mirrored very closely some of the insights, for example, in countries like Austria, where similar effects were seen at that initial voting boost. But on top of this, it also became very, very visible because a lot of young people were engaged. The Scottish Youth Parliament had a big campaign on votes at 16, voter registration drives, and they were listened to quite a lot. Some people for the first time. So young people engaging in political debates in a way that seemed really interesting to them. On top of this, there's also a process that we know takes place, but is often not talked about, and that is young people also influencing their parents, their friends, and other parts of their family. We often talk about socialization in terms of families influencing children, and they do, and we see in our research on the lowering of the voting age in Scotland that indeed there is an influence from parents on young people. But in the same way, we see an influence of young people onto their parents. And in particular, when they have good civic education in school, do they feel empowered to bring up political issues at the proverbial kitchen table or wherever else one might sit and influence debates. And what happened was a big change in public opinion on this issue. While in 2011, only about 30% of the Scottish public approved of the lowering of the voting age, that pretty much doubled in 2015. So within a very short period of time, we now have a majority of people in Scotland who clearly see votes at 16 as a done deal and something they like. Now, why is that? Well, there is a few things. First of all, as said, seeing young people engage in ways that is interesting and sometimes bringing up other issues, especially if they feel enabled to do so through different education mechanisms or organizations, but also because there was a response to it, for example, through the media. The BBC, for example, said we normally only talk about young people on young people's issues. And actually, when we talk about something like Scottish independence that affects the next generation, we need to bring them in more, but we don't have mechanisms for it. So the BBC, for example, set up a panel of 50, 16 and 17-year-olds who were regularly called upon to be brought into programming. And that model was so successful that the BBC did that subsequently for the general election in 2015, the Brexit referendum. So young people featured more often in programming. And suddenly people saw young people talk about political issues on a wide variety of cases. Now, the Conservative leader at the time, Ruth Davidson, started basically saying publicly that she had changed her mind because of that positive experience. Now, there is obviously a degree of strategy behind it because public opinion changes as well, but these elements come together. And while it is true that in Scotland, young people are more likely to vote left parties than right people, indeed, support for the Conservative amongst the younger voters has increased actually subsequently. So to summarize, basically, votes at 16 in Scotland, in many instances, worked very well and in a very successful way. And it created engagement with young people not seen before, so that even the Conservatives changed their views on it.
Yeah, and thanks so much. Thinking about the way in which we bring young people makes me sound so old, but into conversations. When actually, as Gina said, and as Sarah referred to and you, that many, through the climate strike, through Make It 16, through Black Lives Matter internationally, are forcing their voice. A lot of the debate that we've heard in New Zealand has been, well, introducing a lowering the vote has to be accompanied by civics and citizenship. And our governing party, the Labour Party, and the Green Party have both agreed to look at lowering the voting age once a civics and citizenship program has been introduced. So this is a quick ad break as before we introduce our new speaker to say the New Zealand Political Science Association Working Group produced an Our Civics Future report on what the issues were that we thought needed to be covered in civics and citizenship. And we're really delighted that a new set of resources has just been launched. So we have the resources around the Ministry of Education's new focus on civics and citizenship, and it's now what we do with them. So I'd like to introduce Andy Mycock here from Huddesfield, because your Lowering the Voting Age project across the UK has lots of lessons for us, and also some of your insights from other countries that have done this around Austria would be really welcome as well. So Andy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Kia ora, everybody. Good morning. Or good evening, as you can see in the dark murk of Manchester. It's interesting, you're at an interesting point in New Zealand's political history here, in that vote at 16 has finally broken out into a mainstream issue now through the court case and through campaigning and through the fact that it resonated as an issue in the last election in a way that it hasn't done previously. It means that, you know, the genie is out of the bottle. But there is some lessons from the United Kingdom, I think, which might help in terms of how you take on that initial momentum and ensure that you're successful in campaigning to bring vote to 16 in for all elections. And I'm going to limit it to three that we've been running a Leverhulme Trust programme, myself, Jonathan Tong and Thomas Logren at Liverpool University, looking at the issues around where the voting age has been lowered in the UK and where it hasn't, and looking at the lessons for it. We think the first lesson is the way you frame the argument. And as Sarah and Jan and Gina have all highlighted, there's a dispute about adulthood and whether adulthood should be connected with the age of enfranchisement. And quite typically, this turns into a very binary conversation where one side will coalesce all the rights at 18 and say that's the reason why you shouldn't vote age, and the other side will identify rights that they get at 16 and they'll say that's the reason you should. And never the twain shall meet. Sort of people sort of sit there firing ages of consent at each other over the parapet. We would argue that a better way of framing it is to actually accept that there's no one magical point at which someone becomes an adult. Young people start to gain rights from the age of 10 and even earlier, and they don't stop to gain rights until well in their 20s. And in that point, there is not a eureka moment, but instead there's a transition to adulthood, and voting age fits into that transition to adulthood. And in that context, surely the logical approach is that if someone is on a transition to adulthood and they're on a journey, surely it's better to have them being politically active at the beginning of that. Talk about issues of maturity. Maturity is something you can't place. You know, when does someone become mature? Well, there's a disagreement because biologically it may be up to the age of 24. You know, so at what point maturity comes in? Well, there's not many people advocating to raise the voting age to 24. So that sense about maturity simply is one that you discard. But it is about bringing people on board and getting them to accept the fact that there's far likely chance, a greater chance of a young person being politically active, the responsibility at the age of 6, rather than waiting for some, you know, mercurial moment at the age of 18 where suddenly everyone becomes a fully fledged, mature, operative citizen in society. Simply that does not stand up to case. The second point is around welding together political education and voting age reform. And it is essential that those two issues are wired together. The lessons we've learned from where the voting age has been lowered has been that often politicians are very keen about the principle of voting age reform. They're less considered about the idea that democratic socialization is important for every young person, regardless of whether the voting age is 16, 18, 21 or 14. And the danger has been is in both the UK examples so far in Wales and in Scotland, the politicians have been hasty to introduce the voting age. They've been less considered in terms of bringing in proper, universal, democratic socialization, not just in schools, but also in communities, and welding them together. But also making sure that they think about political culture and how you change political culture so that political parties design policies that appeal to young people. It's no good just enfranchising young people. If they don't have a reason to vote, then guess what? They're going to be like the rest of the society. They're not going to vote. So you need to have policies that attract, and you need to have representatives that also look like and feel like they're part of the young demos. And that means you've got to think about the age of representative standing for candidateship. It's no good if you've got a party politics dominated by 50-plus-year-olds if you're trying to change the political culture of society. So these political parties have got a role in this that goes beyond lowering the voting age to thinking about how do you bring more young people in to represent society. I think the third issue is one which is about the culture wars, and Bronwyn's brought attention to this. The Americans call this a third rail issue, and the voting age reform, up until very recently, had avoided that binary. But what's happened over the world, particularly in the Anglosphere, is that voting age reform has become increasingly framed within that wider polarized debate about votes at 60, about society and politics. And I think there is some need to learn the lessons. I think Sarah's right that public opinion doesn't matter. But Jan's also right in that if framed in the right way, public opinion will sway. If you look at what's happened in New Zealand in the last year, support's gone from 7 or 8% to, in some polls, up to 20%. There is a groundswell of change. And in that, you need to make sure, as Jan's argued, that you bring people along from the National Party on this journey. But also that you've got to actually make sure that you provide evidence to support those that have got doubts. And there's plenty of evidence now from Austria and elsewhere that when you bring votes at 16, well, the sky doesn't fall in. Politics, unfortunately, doesn't change overnight either. That's the other side of the lesson. But that it is a necessary progressive step. And my advice to the Make It 16 campaign is be there, the politicians are, and make sure you're informed. But inform those that aren't resolvable. Avoid the maturity debate. Avoid this coalescing around when and someone becomes an adult, and simply focus on the positive evidence. And the positive evidence is everywhere. The votes at 16 is appropriate, and it is a contemporary reform that every polity within the next 20 years will follow. So why shouldn't New Zealand once again be at the vanguard of that change? Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Andy, thanks so much. It's a good point too to come back to the campaigning that Gina and the Make It 16 have done, which is very interesting in that they've Gina, I think I'm right in that you're starting to also turn your focus to thinking about participation of young voters and pre-voters, if we're looking at the 16 to 18-year-olds in New Zealand at the moment, at a local government level, where we have several wider issues too about Māori representation, about how we get general wider representation for the public. But this question of local government and participation between elections is something, James, that you at Royal Holloway have been thinking about in terms of the experiences of London and how our younger citizens can be involved between elections as well in decision making. Would you mind sharing some of those insights with us? It would be great. It's great to have you,
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bronwyn, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for all the really interesting contributions so far. So it's interesting how people justify votes at 16 as a political right, maybe, as people say, or as a route maybe to higher youth turnout, and those are both laudable aims in their own right. But what I want to focus more about is how votes at 16 can be part of a sort of broader process of engaging young people in democracy and in policy making, more to the point, especially at a local level. Andy was saying just before that issues that young people are interested in issues, right? Whether it's climate change, whether it's crime in their local area, whether it's mental health provision, which is obviously something that's very big, especially over here during the lockdown. And the way that you can do this is by engaging young people alongside lowering the voting age to 16. Citizenship education is something that's necessary, but also you need to engage young people in the policy making process. And there are a number of reasons for this, which I'll go through. The first one, which we all know about, is that young people have been the ones who've been most affected by several waves of crisis, the Great Recession, you have the climate emergency that we're going through, then the impact of coronavirus restrictions. On top of that, you also have aging populations. And what this has done for public policy across the world and most established democracies is made it quite reactive and short term. And by lowering the voting age, but also by getting young people engaged more broadly in democracy, you start to tilt the balance towards more future-oriented and sustainable public policy, which is what I guess we all want for the future. And so if we're persuading policymakers and the general public to let younger people have the vote and engage them in democracy more, then this idea of sustainable public policy works better the more that young people are engaged. The reason for that is because their time horizons are simply longer, and then you stop focusing so much on this reactive public policy and look forward a bit more to the future. Personally, I've been working on a big project with young Londoners, looking at the issues that are important to them and trying to get them engaged in City Hall in London. And it's been a great experience. As a researcher, you get to speak to young London. At the time, I grew up in London, but Londoners come from quite different backgrounds to me. It's quite a diverse city. It's mixed. There's lots of ethnic minority younger people in London, almost half now. And really, the one way of getting them engaged in the democratic process is by listening exercises. And we did this in London City Hall and finding out what their issues are. And the reason why this is so important is because Andy says, if you're going to get votes at 16, which is a good measure, you also need to get young people, policymakers listening to the views of young people. And just one example, in London, knife crime, we had, it's become an issue. I mean, it's perhaps not as big as the media makes it out to be, but crime is an issue in London. And we had some really great focus groups, deliberative focus groups with young people, especially with young Black men, and looking at the issues that lead to knife crime. So instead of policymakers just trying to, I don't know, tinker with stop and search activities, they can look to these sort of broader ideas. Do we have mentoring? Do we have youth centres? Do we work on the economic causes of crime? And all of this builds up a much sort of more sustainable approach to public policy. So yes, have votes to 16, definitely the right way forward. It increases the focus on youth-oriented public policy, but you've got to do more. But all democracies have to do more between elections to get young people involved in a democratic process. When that works, you suddenly find much more creative public policy, and you try answering problems 5, 10, 15 years in the future, rather than relying quite so much on the electoral cycle. So everyday politics at a local level, town hall democracy in London seems to work with addressing these issues. Another issue that was covered quite widely was mental health, and it's something that young people talk to us a lot about. Another issue is climate change. And what we did was when we were speaking to these young people, we got other young people doing the focus groups, and they were coming up with their own solutions, surprise, surprise. And so actually, this was quite an empowering process. So empower young people by giving them the vote, but empower them also by bringing them into the policy process. And actually, I've been involved recently with the OECD, and they recently released a youth governance paper, essentially saying that the pathway to good governance is by getting more young people involved. So in other words, increasing the impact and the participation of young people in democracy, whether it's votes at 16 or whether it's in this town hall democracy, is a clear pathway to good governance, as the OECD have said. So it is an issue of political rights. It is an issue of turnout and getting people engaged in democracy, but it is also an issue of having a country with a public policy that is looking after all of its people and also looking forward into the future. And really just to end on a quick note, maybe for policymakers, it is perhaps for some people this idea, the great West German Chancellor Willy Brandt said, of daring more democracy. And I think that that's the point. I think people in political power need to consider the idea of daring more democracy, bringing young people into this process, being prepared for some radical ideas, perhaps, but also some great solutions, especially to the local problems, but also the national and international problems that we all face over the next few years. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. I think daring more democracy is a great phrase. We'll come back to Gina perhaps as we start off the questions, but I'd like to ask Lara Greaves from Auckland University, hearing these debates, knowing for the New Zealand Aotearoa context, what are some of the lessons that you would take? And I'm thinking about the experience, for instance, of the Children's Commissioner in raising, and the New Zealand Electoral Commission have raised issues about why it's important that we think about lowering the voting age. But for the Children's Commissioner, they find this a very polarizing debate, that they get a lot of polarized feedback. So shifting this conversation on, avoiding the culture wars, making this a daring more democracy shared endeavour. What is your response at the moment, Lara, looking at the lessons that you're picking up from the issues that face voters here in New Zealand and the wider community?
Yeah, so kia ora. Thanks everyone for sharing those thoughts. They were great. So I've just been watching and taking notes. I've just got kind of a couple of points. The first one's going to be around the sort of Māori role and some equity issues around different ethnicity and cultural groups in Aotearoa. And then I'll kind of go through a couple of points that came up for me. I'm going to attempt to screen share, because basically what happened is the Royal Society of New Zealand, this is through a colleague of mine, Barry Milne, and mentor at Campus at the University of Auckland, wrote a bit of a summary of sort of fairness in voting. And when we look at New Zealand populations under the age of 18, which I guess people can see on the screen, and even over Zoom, but basically we see that like a higher percentage of the population for Māori and Pacifica, much higher percentage is aged under 18. And when we look at the distributions of age in Aotearoa as well, we see that a lot of Māori are young relative to Europeans and other age groups. So a lot of our sort of Māori and Pacific people especially are concentrated in those younger age groups, and there's a lot of reasons for that we don't really need to go into, but basically this creates an equity issue. And that's where I was wondering at one point, I'm like, is there a Waitangi Tribunal claim here as well? That's what I'll leave that to Gina though, in their campaign. But yeah, basically that was, you know, is kind of an equity issue going forward, that our votes, there's less of us to vote relative to our proportion of the population. I think that generally in terms of the Māori role and Māori votes, we kind of, I think it's really interesting hearing the panel and talking about how, you know, we do need sort of policy processes between elections in place to make sure young people are fully, properly enfranchised in all the decision-making processes, and that we also need some kind of robust civics education in schools and potentially elsewhere as well. And I wonder, in terms of the Māori role, yeah, it does go a bit further, you know, the classics like the social media and the apps, because, like, you know, there's an app to decide, you know, who you're going to vote for, but for rangatahi Māori, young Māori, there's not an app or really much education around which electoral role you're going to choose. So just to give the international guests a bit of context, is that in New Zealand, if you're of Māori descent, you get to choose between the Māori role or the general role. And there are 7 geographic, you know, electorates that overlap and are laid on top of the general electorates. And 52% of Māori are currently on the Māori role. And this creates a few issues administratively for the Electoral Commission. And it was interesting hearing Sarah's comments as well around the sort of the administration behind enrolling young people. This is an area where there's a bit more administration, and we're still kind of having a lot of debates. The Māori electorates are not entrenched, so we've got 6 provisions of our Electoral Act and Constitution Act are entrenched, but the Māori electorates are not entrenched, which has meant that over the last sort of decades and decades and decades, they're used as sort of a political football to kind of talk about Māori rights and stuff along those lines. So we kind of need those. Kind of, I think, a conversation running parallel to the voting age and the term, the 3 versus 4 year term, is this entrenchment of the Māori electorates as well. And we're increasingly having conversations about reform of the local government sector to bring in more Māori wards. Gisborne Council voted yesterday to introduce Māori wards. So the same sort of principle of these reserved Māori seats. And of course we need that more education around this, especially if we're going to bring back the, you know, lower the voting age. So yeah, those were my kind of general points around the sort of Māori role and kind of issues that New Zealand specific issues that we would need to think about. But generally I do find it really interesting. I think that we are at risk of the Green Party sort of having that issue ownership over this, and that's been really interesting hearing your international experiences of making sure that we can bring sort of right-wing voters on board with this issue, because, you know, we will need people on board in order to get a referendum over the line, or to get 75% of MPs to change the voting age. And I think it was really interesting, particularly Jan's comments around the socialization process being both ways, and that young people teaching their family members about politics. And I think that that's particularly important for migrant communities and for, like, yeah, Asian and Pacific communities and other Middle Eastern and Latin American, all of those sort of more recent migrants where we've seen from research, and I've got a lot of students researching in this space, that people don't necessarily have those partisan attachments and necessarily know who they're going to vote for, and then they're less likely to turn out. Asian voter turnout is one of the sort of lower areas of turnout in New Zealand, and so that's a really important issue there that I haven't seen that much in sort of some of these conversations. So that was really cool. And I think in terms of Andy's point around democratic socialization, that's really important for us in terms of getting more awareness around the Māori role. So that really struck me there, and that changing the political culture in communities so people know this is what the Māori role, this is what the general role is, and this is how you make that informed choice to know where you're going. And so, yeah, that was just, yeah, my thoughts. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences today. And yeah, that was excellent.
Thank you, Lara. And this question about how we make a more inclusive and fit for purpose democracy is something that is an ongoing issue. I'm about to ask Gina some of the key points that she's picked up on from listening here that might be relevant to the debates that you're having. But I also then would like to ask all the participants this question about as Sarah said right at the beginning, the disingenuous argument that we'll find reasons to stop young people voting because, subtext, they're not likely to vote for our party. We know that actually young people can vote in different ways. I just wonder if you'd mind, anybody had some reflections on that, because the pragmatics of encouraging parties to be brave are difficult. So Gina, having heard the speakers, are there issues that have emerged for you that are also resonating? Do you want to come back to some of the key points or issues that matter at the moment for young people? And can I also signal, as you're thinking about that, we've got some terrific members of the public who are working for advocacy groups listening in. If you want to share questions or insights, please do. Kate will be picking them up now. And Gina, yes, so where is Make It 16 echoing with some of these points raised?
Oh, I would definitely say almost all of them. Been sitting here just brain ticking away, trying to grasp all the information. Was going to take notes, but just so many good points that I have really enjoyed listening to everyone about them all, and definitely a lot of things that I have thought about before, and we all have thought about before, in terms of, I know exactly some of those opposition points that people have brought up to me, right into my face, of being like, oh, but you're so immature, like you don't know about this and this and this, or you're only going to vote for this party. I guess in terms of that point about, young people are all going to vote this certain way, it's just a matter of political parties stepping up and actually making policies that young people are going to enjoy and are going to actually work to the issues that we care about right now, because that's how they're going to win our vote. But also, I think particularly looking at like local government representation, and I guess representation in general, what Lara was talking about with people who are under 18 being of a much more diverse background than perhaps older generations are. Particularly for me, as someone who has a migrant background, my mum is from Vietnam, I want to be able to vote for people that look like me, who have similar backgrounds to me. And for in a lot of spaces, there are not people who look like me or who have similar, who I can relate to, who have similar values. And so I think particularly what's important to me is getting people who are of more diverse representation coming up to the table to go forward as candidates. Having more young people as candidates is really awesome, and I am trying to encourage some of the friends as we go towards the 2022 local body elections to step up there as well, because I think that's how we can also get some more young people turning out to vote. I guess why Make It 16 is particularly focusing on trying to lower the voting age for the next local body elections is because it's easier to get across, only requires a 50% majority, and then hoping that could set a precedent for the general election the following year, showing that actually the world won't turn upside down when we lower the voting age. Young people will actually turn out, those kinds of things.
Thanks so much, Gina. And that's reminded me that we had apologies from Samantha Paul from the Wellington City Council, who'd been a very strong advocate both for Māori youth and for youth in general, and then became one of the youngest city councillors. But they have a meeting this morning, she can't join us. But she would really echo the comments that you've made, Gina. Turning to this wider disingenuous argument, we've heard the powerful argument that involving young people extends our worldview. What do some of the panelists think about this argument that, oh, well, they generally vote left, so why would we do it? Jan, you've opened that conversation about that there, and we've got a Conservative government at the moment, the opposition that's in a period of renewal. But have we experiences that we can point to in other countries where they have voted in different ways? Sarah, I think, opened that. Anybody who'd like to just speak to that common refrain that we hear? So I was going to say Jan, then James, then Sarah.
Thank you very much. We definitely have seen it in the most recent presidential elections in Austria, for example. A lot of young people voted for a right populist candidate. Now, that in itself obviously isn't a good thing, but as several people pointed out, that should not be the qualifying criterion who people vote for in terms of allocating rights. And really, fundamentally, I think this is one of the arguments that was often put why young people aren't supposedly mature enough is because they change their voting patterns. I think that is a fantastic thing and should be celebrated. That, young people are often much more willing to split tickets, vote for multiple parties, and change. If they're not satisfied with someone, vote for someone later on again. They're actually responsive in a way that, often adults, older adults, aren't necessarily. So I think that's a positive thing. And just briefly from the Scottish experience, there's another reason to argue, and all political parties should like this in its own right, but think about strategically. We've actually seen a decrease in the political participation inequalities in this. So traditionally, younger people from higher socioeconomic classes participate more in all forms of political engagement on average across the UK. In the aftermath of the Scottish independence referendum, we actually saw those inequalities for the 16, 17-year-olds nearly disappear. And we couldn't explain that only by a Scottish referendum effect, because the changes were bigger for young people than they were for the overall population. So there's something that can be done, but it requires active engagement also beyond the initial lowering of the voting age. That's, by the way, something Scotland hasn't been so good at.
Thanks so much, Jan. And that's such an interesting point, because there's been debate here that our parliament at the moment is the most diverse and the youngest it's been, but perhaps socioeconomically more middle class and wealthier. So in terms of thinking about the ways that we bring people in from across our spectrum, this is a really key and useful point. James, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, really, just to echo what Jan was saying, there's no guarantee that young people are going to vote for the centre-left parties. They're less aligned to one party or another and more able to switch. And when parties offer policies that attract them, then they switch over. And so, for example, in the UK, and I think it was 2010, the Conservative Party and Labour Party were more or less split evenly, and Lib Dems as well, amongst the youngest group of voters. And then along comes a Labour Party that starts offering things and aligning its policies with young people, and surprise, surprise, you know, young people are attracted by those policies, and it goes up to 60%, but that's just because of the types of policies that are being offered. But I also just wanted to mention something that Gina was talking about, and also Lara, in terms of marginalised groups. I think that this is why it's so good with votes at 16 and citizenship education and all these other things, is because these are where the biggest gains can be made. And I think this is another way of selling it. So young people who are highly educated and go on to university, etc., are still very likely to be politically active. But younger people who are from poorer backgrounds, who don't go on to university, etc., who are from marginalised groups, who feel marginalised by society, don't engage as much. And things like votes at 16, citizenship education, engaging people in town hall democracy, all of those things can play a much more positive role with young people from marginalised backgrounds than they do with young people who are already engaging from maybe more privileged backgrounds. And this is why, another reason why it's so important.
Thanks. Sarah, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, just about the point about young people always voting for the left. That's not true. In Britain, during the Thatcher years, most young people voted for Thatcher. And as James said, in 2010, the vote was equally between the three main parties. The Liberal Democrats did well because of the promise to scrap tuition fees, which they reneged on. But here in France, majority of young people vote far left or far right, or just vote blank. So it also depends on the electoral system, and that so it's much more wider than just what we've been talking about, the like structural issues about how electoral systems work and proportional representation. Because if you don't think that your vote counts, then you know there's not the point. What's the point in voting? But certainly, conservative parties, right-wing parties could gain. Do and will gain votes from young people. The last general election in Britain was about 17%, which is a decrease because of the Labour Party getting more votes. But I mean, I'll go back to how I finished. If there were policies, as Gina said, to inspire them, and if they were on the right side of history, and if they made the effort to reach out to young people. But I should add also that this isn't become something that worries me, is it becomes an intergenerational battle between let's make policies for young people and let's forget about the elder people. It doesn't have to be that way without being idealistic. And I think one of the dangers is that in discussions like we're going to live longest with the consequences of these policies, that you have to be careful about not excluding the older people as well. You take them along as well, and one doesn't exclude the other, and that governments take into account all generations from an intergenerational consideration.
Thanks very much, Sarah. This question, both about intergenerational solidarity, about avoiding culture wars, about also thinking into the long term, are very valuable for us as lessons. But your other point that you need structural reform to your electoral system as well to ensure that people feel that their vote is meaningful and they can be heard is quite crucial for New Zealand under our MMP system. And as Lara says, while we're thinking about some of the other structural reforms around Māori seats, around the length of our term. And there is the question that you raised, Sarah, in there about the voting for the far left or the far right, raises the more theoretical questions, which are possibly not so interesting for the public, but are very interesting and challenging for political scientists, that Hannah Arendt raised, in her concern about young voters being overwhelmed, or the rise of more extremist voting being one of her biggest concerns, kind of circles back to thinking about how we have systems of inclusion in our democratic process. And I know that there have been a number of resources that have been suggested in the chat function. Kate, you might have to speak into your microphone a bit because the mic's a bit quiet, but would you be able to tell us some of because these chats won't be saved for the recording, some of the books that have been suggested, and if any of the panelists want to add some books, their own, this is the moment for self-citation, don't be shy. We've all asked you because you've been doing a lot of really interesting work, or others, we'd love to hear from you. So Kate, the books that have already been shared.
Yeah, so Sarah referred to a couple of books in her talk. And so the first one was Making Up People, Youth, Truth and Politics by Judith Besant. And that's, I popped that in the chat function. And she also talked about a book by one of our lovely panelists, Jan, and it was edited by him and his colleague, Johannesburg, Lowering the Vote Age to 16, and that's published by Palgrave. And I've also had a few direct messages from the audience, just thanking us for the insights from the panel. People really appreciate the comments that you've provided today. Oh, and there's a book that James has just added, so Youthquake 2017, The Rise of Young Cosmopolitans. And Sarah's just popped up another one, Politics, Protests and Young People. And I think there's a chapter on votes at 16, so do check them out.
Yeah, I should add that James edits a series with Palgrave. We might see if we can link this discussion to it around young voting. But we've just had a question from the audience. Kate, are you able to bring that question in?
Yeah, so does we're just wondering how many other jurisdictions have made it 16 or lower. And there's a comment as well, for the physical punishment law change, New Zealand was country number 48. Although the first English-speaking country, just a comment, yeah.
To make that change, yeah. So, yeah, how many, just quickly off the top of our head, it's like a Q&A pub quiz, how many countries have already lowered the voting age or jurisdictions to 16 or lower? Any starter for one?
Not that many, probably about 10, I would say. Jan might have the precise figure, but it's still a relatively small amount. And
in some cases,
many of those countries haven't lowered the voting age universally. Some of them, such as many of the South American countries, have different focus on compulsory voting for 18 to 70-year-olds than it's voluntary for 16 and 17-year-olds. And some countries have lowered the voting age. It's quite questionable whether they're democratic. Cuba would be the best example of that. So I think the interesting thing is that it's not the tsunami that we saw after the UK lowered the voting age in 1969 to 18. And we've done a lot of research on the different arguments between 1969 and New Zealand followed very swiftly. Within the space of a decade, you saw virtually every liberal democracy in the world lower its voting age to 18. Austria lowered the voting age in 2008, I think it was, Université, or 2009. it hasn't led to the same kind of domino effect. And I think that's partially because the debate has got lost in this issue around adulthood. And so it's meant that it's much more difficult to convince people, but also that there's actually more public interest in debates now than there were in the late 1960s. There was really very little contention about lowering the voting age to 18. Most people accepted 18-year-olds were adults. And most people within the spirit of the 60s and early 70s thought that it was an appropriate, reform in society. It matched people's expectations. Voter 16s had a much more difficult opportunity trajectory in terms of that. And I think that's why in New Zealand's case, like the situation in Australia, and I would encourage that you connect with your colleagues across the Tasman Sea, because it's a very similar debate in Australia than it is in New Zealand, is that it has got lost in party politics. My general advice is to think incrementally, and particularly look at the experience of what's happened in the UK, that first Scotland, then Wales, and then wherever next. If you're thinking about New Zealand, well, focus on local elections if that's the greatest chance you have of bringing some reform in. Don't aim just at universal reform, think about it as an incremental process. And also think about the one piece of evidence which may well be still difficult for all of us who are advocates, which is that although votes at 16 has increased the number of 16 and 17-year-olds participating and voting when compared to 18 to 24-year-olds, they still haven't yet exceeded the average turnout in any of the countries where the voting age has been lowered. It is not a panacea on its own to reforming the problems of political engagement. And I think that links to what all these speakers have said, and I'm really interested to hear what Gina and Lara are saying, is that there's a need to think about it in the round. This is a holistic reform of your political system, not just a simple lowering of the age of enfranchisement. It's about political culture. It's about how the way that society does politics. And simply lowering the voting age potentially could just push down for some political disengagement to an earlier age if you don't think about this broader issue about how do you change politics itself. Sorry, that was quite a long answer to a simple question. 10.
No, but it's a good cue. Thank you so much for perhaps giving Gina and Lara the last word in terms of, as we wrap up the panel, any additional thoughts you just want to make now as we're closing, and especially I'll come to perhaps Lara last because we're looking at quite a different election that we've just had in terms of our enthusiasm and turnout. But Gina, any other final thoughts from all the work that you and Make It 16 are doing?
Yeah, I guess, all those points just mentioned, definitely agree with. I have a lot of reckons about how we can improve our electoral system and constitution, all those kinds of things as well. And I think lowering the voting age is something that a lot of the public can really understand quite easily, whereas some of those other ones are a bit harder. And so I guess, yeah, really keen to get a lot of change happening in the near future. And I have really enjoyed everyone's points. Have definitely given me a lot of thoughts about things that are going to happen in the future.
Thank you. And Lara, any last thoughts from the New Zealand Political Science Association? Sorry to put you in the situation of summing up, but some lessons to take home.
No, I just want to reiterate my thanks to all of the panelists today and the people for joining us and the people who are watching the recording. I think that, yeah, these are really important conversations for us to have as sort of political scientists, because I think that a lot of us are in this because we want to get more participation in democracy and more representation, and get representation to be more representative. So just thank everyone. And yeah, I just definitely would say that, yeah, this is just something that I'm watching going forward. And yeah, thanks to Gina and others from the Make It 16 campaign for really putting this in the public imagination or on the agenda and getting it into the media, because it was something that hasn't necessarily been there before. And I think that ultimately we do have this sort of fairly powerful centre-left government at the moment, although it's debatable how centre-left they are, and we're kind of looking to see what's going to be happening in terms of any kind of reform, because they have mentioned that some kind of electoral reform will be, and it's part of the Green Party cooperation agreement as well, that there will be people looking at this more, and so that's a real good opportunity going forward to bring this as part of that debate. But yeah, thanks everyone for participating today.
Thank you, and that's a very good reminder that the Prime Minister has said that votes for at 16 is something that they will seriously look at once the civics and citizenship is embedded. And if they're looking for transformative change, as we've talked about today, this brings in the long view, this changes the way in which we have our conversation and who's heard. So I think it's definitely an issue that we as an association will be picking up and following strongly. As we've talked about, there is definitely a growing public momentum and realization that this is an issue that won't go away, that needs some urgent attention in an aging society if we want a fair democracy that's fit for purpose. So I would really like to thank our panelists at all hours of the day and night around the world for joining the New Zealand Political Science Association's Working Groups discussion. It's been really invaluable, and thanks again to Make It 16.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a good
Bronwyn.
day.
Thanks, Lara.
Have a good
Thanks,
evening.
Gina. Thanks, Kate.